He was no bigger than a squirrel when someone first spotted him pressed into the shadows where two brick walls met, behind Harper's Supply on the edge of Flagstaff. At first glance, he looked like any abandoned kitten, frail, filthy, trembling in the cold of the high desert night. But on closer inspection, something was off. Those ears, those eyes, the way he tracked every single movement. No one expected to find a creature like this in a place like that. And when wildlife rescuer Julia Carter arrived, she had braced herself for the worst. Yet the tiny being wasn't just clinging to life. He was staring straight at her, with a gaze that stopped her in her tracks. Julia had rescued countless wild animals before, but this one was different. He didn't behave the way wild hearts are supposed to, and what happened next would not be just another rescue story. It was a journey Julia herself could never have imagined she was about to take. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and be sure to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our surprising new stories. The October wind swept through the alley behind Harper's Supply in Flagstaff, Arizona, carrying the damp scent of pine and the cool earth that signaled an approaching rain. Julia Carter had been running the Red Rock Wildlife Rescue Center for 15 years. But the phone call that came in that Tuesday morning would haunt her for the rest of her life. "There's something behind the store," a raspy voice said over the line. It was Earl Harper himself, the man who had spent his entire life with the family shop that had stood since 1950. At first, I thought it was just a stray cat. But Julia, I don't think so. It's got these little tufts on its ears, and the eyes, they're nothing like I've ever seen. Julia quickly grabbed her familiar rescue kit, thick leather gloves, a carrier, a blanket, and the small bottle of emergency formula she always kept ready. Then she sped away from the rescue center, driving the 20 minutes into Flagstaff. The early morning sun had just begun to spread its warmth across the high desert, painting the San Francisco peaks a brilliant gold under the clear blue sky. Over the years, she had rescued countless creatures in urban areas: hawks tangled in fishing line, wild hogs struck by cars, even a lost mountain lion cub. But there was something in Mr. Harper's voice over the phone that had set her heartbeat racing faster than usual. Julia found Mr. Harper waiting at the back entrance of the store. His sun-weathered face was creased, etched deep with worry. At 73, he had seen plenty of wild animals wander into town, but this time was different. He pointed toward the corner where two brick walls met, forming a small alcove, half hidden behind a discarded wooden pallet. "It's been there since I opened up at 6 this morning," Harper said softly. "I haven't dared go near it. Figured you'd know what to do." Julia approached slowly, her eyes trained through years of experience scanning every detail. The first thing she noticed, it was far too small. No bigger than a squirrel, really, curled into the darkest corner of that brick alcove. Its fur was ragged, matted with dirt, a mottled brown and gray, something that might have gleamed with wild beauty if it weren't dulled under a film of grime. It was those ears that confirmed what Harper had feared. The black tufts jutting out like tiny flags, an unmistakable sign this was no ordinary cat. Before them was a Bobcat Kitten, and by the looks of it, he could not have been more than 5 weeks old. His pale green eyes, far too large for his gaunt face, locked onto Julia's gaze as she knelt about 6 feet away. Even from that distance, Julia could clearly see the rapid rise and fall of his tiny chest, the way his fragile body pressed desperately against the cold brick wall, as if hoping he could vanish into it. This wasn't just fear. This was bone-deep terror, the kind only a wild creature knows after losing everything familiar in its world. "Hello, little one," Julia whispered, her voice soft as the morning breeze. "It's okay. You're safe now." The tiny creature's response was a sound Julia knew she would never forget. A growl, trying so hard to be fierce, but coming out as nothing more than a raspy, feeble wheeze. He was fighting with everything he had left, and the truth was, There wasn't much. Julia could clearly see the ridge of his spine, the sharp jut of his hip bones beneath the matted fur. This bobcat kitten had endured loneliness for days, maybe even longer, with seasoned patience. Julia pulled on her thick leather gloves. After 15 years of wildlife rescue, she knew well, even the smallest creatures, when panicked, could inflict unexpected and serious injuries. Julia had once seen a screech owl, weighing barely 3 pounds, drive its talons straight through a volunteer's hand. And a bobcat kitten, even 1 week from hunger, still carried claws and teeth that nature had designed as perfect weapons. "Earl," she called softly, without taking her eyes off the corner. "Can you grab that old towel from my truck? The green one in the back?" As Harper's heavy footsteps retreated, Julia kept speaking in a low voice to the trembling little creature huddled in the brick alcove. She had long since learned that the calm, steady sound of a human voice could sometimes work wonders for animals gripped by fear. Julia spoke to the bobcat kitten, as though to a child, about the small, warm enclosure waiting for him at the rescue center, about the bottle of formula she would warm to just the right temperature, the soft blankets, and the quiet, safe space where he could finally rest after days of despair. The kitten's growl slowly faded, leaving only a low rumble born more of exhaustion than threat. His eyes never left Julia's face. In those wild green pupils was a strange mixture of fear and something more elusive. Perhaps the faintest spark of hope. Or perhaps, Julia thought, it was only her imagination. When Harper returned with the green towel in hand, Julia knew she had to act immediately. The tiny creature was weakening before her eyes, its head beginning to droop despite its struggle to stay alert. With movements honed by years of experience, Julia swiftly spread the towel wide. In one smooth motion, she scooped up the small body, wrapping it securely but with gentle care. The creature's resistance made Julia's heart ache. It twisted and snarled, trying to bite through the fabric with tiny teeth no bigger than grains of rice. Its claws, weak yet still sharp, snagged in the threads as it struggled desperately. But the struggle lasted only seconds before exhaustion prevailed. The bobcat kitten went limp in Julia's arms, gasping in short, shallow breaths, helpless in a way that broke her heart. "Is it going to make it?" Earl asked, and Julia could hear in his voice the same heavy worry pressing against her own chest. "I'll do everything I can," she replied, striding quickly toward the truck. Inside, a carrier was already prepared, lined with soft fleece to hold warmth. Julia placed the tiny creature, still wrapped in the towel, carefully inside, watching as it immediately pressed itself into the farthest corner, trying to make its body so small it might vanish. The drive back to the Red Rock Wildlife Rescue Center felt both endless and fleeting. In Julia's mind, the necessary protocols began to play through step by step. First, warmth. Hypothermia, that was the silent killer of young lives in the wild. Next would come a full examination, checking for signs of injury, parasites, or hidden illness. If the cub was too weak to drink, Julia would have to administer fluids, injected subcutaneously, each drop a thread of life. Only once he was stabilized would she begin feeding. The Red Rock Wildlife Rescue Center sat on more than 20 acres of high desert land, operating through donations and grants, run by Julia and a rotating team of dedicated volunteers. The facility was divided into specialized enclosures for countless species, from tiny hummingbirds to full-grown black bears. But now, Julia headed straight for the nursery, a converted barn with heated pens, medical equipment, and everything needed to pull orphaned wild lives back from the brink. Her assistant, Emily Sanders, a veterinary student from Northern Arizona University, completing her internship, appeared at the door. "Earl already called ahead," Emily said, pulling on rubber gloves, her eyes betraying clear concern. "Mr. Harper said you've brought back a bobcat kitten, about 5 weeks old, severely malnourished, dehydrated, and in a state of panic?" Emily asked, her voice tight with worry. "That's right," Julia replied, lifting the carrier onto the prepared examination table. Let's see what we're dealing with. When Julia opened the carrier, she gently lifted the towel-wrapped bundle out. The cub had curled himself into a tight little ball, and for a fleeting moment, Julia shuddered with the fear that the worst had already happened. But then, through the layers of fabric, she felt the faint yet rapid heartbeat, the fragile stir of breath. "It's okay, little one," Julia whispered, carefully unwrapping the towel layer by layer. "Let's have a look." What they saw tightened their hearts, yet also offered a glimmer of hope. The cub was male, weighing only about 4 pounds, when at this age he should have been closer to 7. His paw pads were raw, a clear sign he had walked a long, lonely distance. There were no obvious wounds, no visible signs of illness, but his body temperature was dangerously low, and his pale gums revealed severe dehydration. "Get the heating pad," Julia ordered, her voice firm. Emily moved instantly, quick and precise as if she had done this 100 times before. Set it on low and grabbed the fluid bag from the warming cabinet. Together they worked with the practiced rhythm of a seasoned rescue team, beginning the process of pulling life back from the brink. The subcutaneous fluids went in, creating a small bubble beneath the kitten's thin fur, slowly absorbing, rehydrating his depleted body. The cub barely resisted, too weak to summon the strength. They placed him on the heating pad, covering him with a soft blanket, while Julia monitored every small change in his body temperature. "What do you think happened to him?" Emily asked softly, as she prepared a bottle of specialized formula designed for bobcats. Julia shook her head gently, her eyes fixed on the frail rise and fall of his tiny chest. "Most likely, he's been orphaned. His mother could have been hit by a car on Route 89. That highway cuts right through prime bobcat territory. Or she may have been scared off by something while hunting. At 5 weeks old, kittens are just beginning to follow their mothers outside, but they're nowhere near ready to survive on their own." The first attempt at feeding failed. The cub turned his head away from the bottle, lips sealed tight, his eyes still wide and wild. Julia wasn't surprised. Wild animals often refused food in the first hours, too stressed and frightened to take a sip. But she knew he desperately needed nutrition. "Give him an hour," Julia decided, her voice low and steady. "Let him warm up. Let the fluid start to work. Then we'll try again." That single hour stretched into what felt like an endless wait. Julia sat beside the small pen, watching each fragile breath of the bobcat cub, and in her mind, she had already begun calling him by a name: Valor. She always reminded herself never to name the wild creatures in her care, to make it easier when the time came to release them back into the wild. But something about this little fighter made it impossible not to. When she tried again with the bottle formula warmed to just the right temperature, held at just the right angle, Valor surprised her. His tiny pink tongue flicked out, cautiously tasting a drop, and then, as if a switch had been flipped, he latched onto the rubber nipple, sucking with a hunger that was fierce, desperate. "Good boy," Julia whispered, her eyes blurring with sudden, unexpected tears. "My brave boy." The following weeks passed in a blur of round-the-clock feedings, repeated medical procedures, and the unending patience required to build fragile trust. Valor, the name that clung to him despite all of Julia's efforts to resist, began to gain weight. His once dull, matted coat slowly revealed its true beauty. A tawny gold fur marked with bold black spots, patterns that would fade as he grew older. The black-tipped ears standing tall, and the stubby tail, the very traits that defined the bobcat. But it was his personality that truly began to shine as his health returned. Unlike most bobcat cubs, Julia had rehabilitated, who kept their wild distance even within the safety of care. Valor seemed to crave contact. Each time Julia entered his pen, he began to purr, the sound like a diesel engine idling. He played with ferocity, pouncing on toys with raw instinct, only to immediately dash toward her, rubbing against her legs like a house cat. "Something's not right," Emily remarked, watching as Valor climbed into Julia's lap during a medical check, kneading his front paws against her arm as if seeking comfort. "He's imprinting, isn't he?" Julia gave a slight nod, worry etched across her face. Imprinting when a young animal began to identify with humans instead of its own kind was the very thing every wildlife rehabilitator worked tirelessly to avoid. It meant the creature could never safely return to the wild. He would lack the instinctive fear of humans, seeking them out for food or comfort, and that usually ended in tragedy for the animal. "We need to limit contact," Julia said, her voice firm, even as her heart tightened when Valor pressed his head beneath her chin, his purr growing louder as if pleading. "Start feeding him with the bottle holder, not by hand. Less interaction during cleaning." They tried. For 2 weeks, the team followed strict protocols to keep him as wild as possible, but Valor seemed to have a will of his own. He cried out pitifully, a chilling sound like a blend of a rusty gate and a baby's wail every time he was left alone. He stubbornly refused the bottle on the holder, losing weight visibly until Julia was forced to give in, cradling him in her arms and feeding him by hand again. When they introduced him to Aspen, a fellow orphaned bobcat cub brought in a week after Valor, in hopes he would bond with his own kind, Valor showed polite interest in Aspen, but always returned to the fence closest to the human area, his eyes fixed on Julia as if waiting for something familiar. The turning point came when Valor was about 4 months old. Julia was cleaning his enclosure, believing he was secured safely in the holding area, when suddenly she felt an unexpected weight land on her back. Her first instinct was panic, because even a young bobcat could inflict serious injury. But instead of sharp claws or teeth, she felt the rumbling vibration of a purr and his front legs wrapping around her shoulders, an action that could only be described as a hug. "Valor!" Julia gasped, carefully reaching back to support his body. "How did you even—" Emily's laughter from the doorway provided the answer. "He just figured out the latch. I saw him do it. He was just waiting for you to turn your back." From that day on, Valor's hugs became a regular habit. As he grew quickly, reaching his adult weight of more than 30 pounds, with legs too long for his body and paws the size of tea saucers, his affection only grew stronger. Each time Julia approached, Valor would rise up on his hind legs, wrapping his front legs around her waist. As he grew taller, he would loop them around her shoulders instead, pressing his broad, solid head against her neck, his purr so powerful that visitors could clearly hear it from 50 feet away. The decision about Valor's future was something that weighed heavily on Julia. Every professional instinct as a wildlife rehabilitator told her that wild animals belonged in the wild. But after many consultations with veterinarians and behavioral specialists, all confirmed what Julia already knew deep in her heart. Valor would never survive in the wild. The imprinting of humans on him had become permanent, irreversible. To him, humans were his family, his pride. Releasing him back into the wild would be nothing less than a death sentence. Yet another issue arose. When Valor was 6 months old, during a routine checkup, Dr. James Whitaker, the longtime veterinary partner of the Red Rock Center, discovered a troubling truth. His heart, Dr. Whitaker explained, pointing to the ultrasound screen. There's a minor defect, most likely congenital. In the wild, he probably wouldn't have survived his first year. Right now, it doesn't affect his quality of life much. But the strain of hunting, defending territory, competing for mates, it would be too much. The final decision became clear. Valor would serve as an educational ambassador for the Red Rock Wildlife Rescue Center. Julia filed for the special permits, built a separate enclosure designed to balance the bobcat's need for space with Valor's craving for human interaction, and with painstaking patience, began the process of training this extraordinary bobcat to step before the public, becoming a living bridge between the wild and humanity. It was a role Valor seemed born to fulfill. During school visits, he often left entire classrooms gasping in amazement as he demonstrated the extraordinary leap of his kind. A bobcat can jump as far as 12 feet in a single bound. While Julia explained to the students how those traits helped bobcats survive in the wild, Valor would calmly show off his enormous paws built to tread lightly on snow, even though he himself would likely never see snow in the high deserts of Arizona. And yes, he would hug Julia. This extraordinary display of affection never failed to astonish audiences, while driving home the message that though Valor was unique, wild animals ultimately belonged in the wild. "He's not a pet," Julia always emphasized, her voice carrying across the room to both children and adults. Their eyes wide as Valor wrapped his legs around her shoulders, his purr resonating loudly enough to be heard even without a microphone. Valor is here because he cannot survive in the wild. But his wild cousins are different. They need their space, their territory, their freedom. The best thing we can do for bobcats is to protect their habitat and observe them from a distance. Years passed, and Valor's story spread far and wide. Videos of him hugging Julia went viral, bringing not only attention but also vital donations that allowed the Red Rock Wildlife Rescue Center to continue its mission. People drove from hundreds of miles away to attend the educational programs, just to see the bobcat who hugged. But for Julia, that fame meant nothing compared to the quiet moments. The early mornings when she found Valor waiting by the fence, his eyes lit with recognition and filled with an indescribable affection. The way he chuffed in greeting a sound wild bobcats, reserved only for their closest family. The solid weight of his trust as he pressed against her, purring like a diesel engine rumbling to life on a cold morning. Emily, now graduated and a veterinarian herself, but still volunteering at the center, once asked Julia if she ever regretted that Valor could not live wild. At that moment, Julia was sitting on the old wooden bench in the back lot. Valor sprawled across her lap, in a way that was both comical and deeply touching, his big head tucked under her chin. In that instant, memories came flooding back. Julia thought of the starving, trembling cub pressed desperately against the cold brick wall behind Harper's Supply. And she thought of the thousands of people, especially children, who had learned the value of wildlife conservation through Valor's story. Julia thought of the dozens of other bobcats the center had successfully rehabilitated and released back into the wild rescues made possible by the very funding Valor's fame had brought. "Every wild creature deserves to live in the wild," Julia finally said, her voice low but steady. "But sometimes, life has other plans." Valor could not return to the forest, but he had become something else, a bridge between two worlds. He showed people that wildlife can be both magnificent and capable of love, yet they are not pets, nor entertainment. They are individuals worthy of respect and protection. Julia gently scratched behind Valor's black tufted ears, feeling the rumble of his purr reverberate through his chest, strong and resolute, like an affirmation. Do I wish he could have lived wild? Of course. But am I grateful for what he's become? Every single day. Today, 8 years after that cold October morning, Valor still greets Julia with his familiar hugs. His muzzle now bears the dignified touch of gray, and he moves with the careful solemnity of middle age instead of the explosive wild energy of youth. The educational programs have now expanded online, allowing Valor to teach children around the world about bobcat conservation without the stress of long travel. Earl Harper, now 81, still visits the center every month, bringing bags of supplies from his store and always asking after his bobcat, the little life he saved years ago with a single phone call. He loves retelling the story to anyone who will listen about that morning. The tiny cub, shivering against the cold brick wall, who grew up to hug everyone he meets. People think wild animals are all teeth and claws, Earl often says, his eyes shining as he watches Valor show off a leap for a group of school children. And sure, they are. That's their nature. But they also know how to trust, how to feel, and they can teach us something about resilience and survival. That little bobcat taught me this. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about accepting help when you need it. About learning to trust again, even after you've lost everything. The last educational program of the day came to a close. Families filed out one by one, their laughter and conversations lingering in the air. Children chattered excitedly about the hugging bobcat, while their parents discussed the conservation insights Julia had shared. Valor, tired but content, stretched out on his favorite platform, his pale green eyes following Julia's every movement. The wild spark was still there, but softened now by years wrapped in trust and affection. As Julia approached the enclosure for the evening routine, a final check, fresh water, and yes, one more hug, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey. From a starving, terrified cub on the edge of giving up, to becoming an ambassador for his kind, Valor had surpassed every expectation. He stood as proof that sometimes the creatures who cannot return to the wild still carry another mission, to become a bridge for conservation. Sensing her approach, Valor rose slowly, stretching luxuriously before padding toward the fence. When Julia arrived, he lifted himself onto his hind legs, sliding his front paws through the special greeting window. Julia bent down, arms open to receive him, as Valor wrapped his legs around her shoulders. In that moment, the rumble of his purr echoed, resonating through his body and into her heart, a song of wilderness and trust, carried into the stillness of the Arizona twilight. "Hello, my brave boy," Julia whispered. They were the same words she had spoken to Valor every single day for 8 years. "Thank you for trusting me." In response, Valor pressed his broad head against her neck, his purr growing louder, deep, and warm. A wild heart that had found its home not on the wind-swept mountains where his kind still roamed, but in the fragile space between nature and humanity, teaching the world that conservation begins with compassion, one hug at a time. The sun set behind the San Francisco peaks, painting the sky in ribbons of pink and gold, reflecting the tawny coat of a bobcat once no bigger than a squirrel, trembling against a brick wall, who had fought to survive against all odds, and now stood as living proof that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Tomorrow there would be more programs, more lessons, more children inspired by the importance of protecting wild places and wild hearts. But tonight, there was only this: a woman and a bobcat, bound by a rescue that became a friendship, a terror transformed into trust, and a love that built a bridge between two worlds, wild and human, forever intertwined.